Good evening, and welcome to all our Buffalo Branch AAUW members and guests. I am Betty Preble, a member of the Branch Program Committee this year, and I am delighted to see all of you on the screen this evening. Grace Angela Henry is a voice and theatrical actor, a third-generation social justice activist, an educator, nonprofit leader, and a history buff. She lives in New York's Hudson Valley, where she is also known for a production of historic graveyard tours. As we celebrate Women's History Month and all that we have achieved, we should always remember that we women were not always inclusive in our history. As Sojourner Truth might have said, "Ain't I a woman?" What might she have said today about women's rights, education, leadership, and social justice? Angela Henry wrote a report on Ms. Truth in elementary school. In college, she won the Sojourner Truth Academic Award. Right across the Hudson River from Angela's home sits a historical plaque recognizing Ms. Truth's birthplace. Sojourner Truth has been a kind of guardian angel and sister spirit in Angela's life. And the more Angela has learned about her, the more common threads she has found. Tonight, she will bring her to life, from childhood through Sojourner's personal quest to make life in these United States more equitable for all. Now, I suggest that you make sure that your screen view is active speaker and that you are muted, and then sit back to enjoy our program. Here's Angela as Sojourner Truth.
Greetings, my friends. Greetings, my friends. I am Sojourner Truth, and it is with great pleasure that I speak with the Buffalo chapter of the American Association of University Women, the AAUW. The AAUW was formed just 3 years before I died, but we have so much in common that I find it a most comfortable conversation. The mission of the AAUW is to enhance gender equity for women and girls through research, education, and advocacy. Research. That is so important, to find out, to get to the root of things. I may not have known to call it research then, but research is part of what led to the return of my dear son, Peter, who had been taken away from me. Yes, I'll tell you about that. A court case in Ulster County, New York, not even a day's walk from where I lived, and education, which can take many forms and is so important to understanding and interpreting what is happening around us and to us. Advocacy? Well, I think I've been advocating most of my life. It's certainly what I am known for. The AAUW's vision is simple, but so hard. Equity for all. Equity for all. Another thing I am known to have fought for, and the values of the AAUW are ones I could also embrace: nonpartisan, fact-based, integrity, inclusion, and intersectionality. These are the guiding principles of my life, really. I'm especially known for my work in the 1860s to help women get the right to vote. It was the voting rights of white women we were fighting for at the time, because there were so many things that Black women, Chinese women, Irish and German women in this country did not have the rights to do. But many rights, including voting rights, were eventually extended beyond white men, white women, the rich, and the privileged. You tell me that even today, almost 140 years after I died, Black people and other people are still being kept from voting in this country. History repeating itself? people repeating history. There are so many people across the country who have been working so hard to protect people's right to vote, ability to vote. They are repeating the history of Frederick Douglass, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, and countless suffragists who fought for disenfranchised people's right to vote and the ability to vote. There was voting trickery back then too, you know. The voting rights warriors of today are repeating productive and good history. There's that advocacy in the AAUW's mission. I've heard the story of Rosa Parks in 1955, the courageous woman who refused to move out of her seat in the segregated Black section, by the way, so a white man could sit in that row of seats. But did you know she was repeating history? Courageous history? There were others who had stood up or sat down for their rights, like Claudette Colvin. When Miss Colvin was 15 years old, she refused to move to the back of the bus and give up her seat to a white person, and this was 9 months before Rosa Parks did the same thing. The bus driver ordered her to get up, and she refused, saying she'd paid her fare and it was her constitutional right. 2 police officers put her in handcuffs and arrested her. As she tells it, all I remember is I was not going to walk off the bus voluntarily. And here's a piece of irony. It was Negro History Month, and at her segregated school, they had been studying Black leaders like Harriet Tubman and, well, me, Sojourner Truth. Young Claudette Colvin went to jail. A 15-year-old girl. Well, there's nothing new about that for Black people, is there? But she stood up for her rights and even wrote a book about it. Claudette Colvin, Twice Toward Justice. Little did Claudette or Rosa Parks or any of the other courageous people fighting for their rights know that they were repeating my good history and other people's good history. You know, horse-drawn streetcars in Washington, D.C. had been desegregated by federal law in 1865, but the drivers would rarely stop for Black people. One time, I was getting on a streetcar behind my white colleague, Josephine Griffin, an abolitionist from Ohio I had known for years. She got on, but the driver just took off before I could get on. The streetcar dragged me a ways before stopping. Well, Mrs. Griffin and I took the conductor's badge number. He saw me trying to mount those steps, and we contacted the streetcar company president, who turned out to be a sympathetic Northerner. The conductor was dismissed. Oh, another time, a conductor and driver pretended not to see me when I signaled for them to stop. Another streetcar was coming along and tried to pass me by, but I raised my hand and yelled, "I want to ride. I want to ride. I want to ride." I stopped the streetcar, and all the traffic around the streetcar blocked it from moving. I got on. People on the streetcar were laughing at my success, and the conductor said to me, "Go forward where the horses are, or I will throw you out." I told him I was from the Empire State and knew the laws as well as he did. I stayed right where I was and got off at my destination. As I said, history doesn't repeat itself. We repeat history. I was not from Washington, D.C., but I had traveled to many states and cities, so I knew how to handle myself. Not like the refugees in Washington at that time. You may not know that I spent much time working with refugees, American refugees. Yes, American refugees. Slaves who had escaped to freedom states where slavery was illegal. Freed men and women who made their way to states where slavery was illegal. Refugees, you ask? You think of refugees as people who flee a country because of danger or persecution or perhaps natural disasters, environmental reasons. Now, think of the men and women who fled from enslavement to the north, or even to Canada if they could get there. Refugees. And what does a former slave from a Georgia cotton plantation or a former slave from a Louisiana sugar plantation do when he arrives in New York? What kind of work can a former household slave get when she arrives in Philadelphia? Can either of them read or write? Can they do their sums and handle money? Being freed by an enslaver or by the Emancipation Proclamation did not give the former slave a place to live, a job, a community of friends and family. These were refugees, plain and simple, both before and after the abolition of slavery. And for several years, they were my focus. When I arrived in Washington, D.C. in 1864, tens of thousands of former slaves from neighboring Maryland and Virginia had fled there. I went to a refugee camp set up by the government and run by the Reverend D.B. Nichols. I worked there and at some other camps operated by the National Freedmen's Relief Association and also the Freedmen's Bureau. I received room and board and sometimes a cash stipend from the Freedmen's Relief Association. And in 1870, the Freedmen's Bureau paid me $390 for 26 months of work. I used that money towards the mortgage on my house in Battle Creek, Michigan, by the way. Never get behind on your mortgage. My work with the refugees included advice on moral living. You know I'm a God-fearing, God-loving woman, and preaching is what I do. And I talked to them about how things were done in the North. For example, cooking recipes and methods were very different in the North. A woman might have been the best cook on any plantation in her Louisiana parish, but that wouldn't have gotten her a job in any fashionable home up north. I also talked to the refugees about white Northerners who had been advocating for their cause for years. Most had no experience with white people who were against slavery, and I encouraged them to learn how to be independent. Not an easy thing for people whose lives had not been their own. But I too had been enslaved. I knew something about their former lives. I was born into slavery sometime around 1797 on Roundout Creek, near where it joins the Wallkill River in Hurley, in the town of Rosendale, New York. There's a little historical plaque there. Maybe you've seen it. My parents were James and Elizabeth, and our owner was Johannes Hardenberg, who died soon after I was born. My mother was my father's third wife. The other two were sold away from him. The Hardenbergs were Dutch settlers, and others of my owners were Dutch, so Dutch was my language growing up. Onze Vader, die in den Hemlein zijt, our Father, who art in heaven. I learned that prayer in Dutch from my mother. I kept a strong Dutch accent throughout my life, but I'm speaking the way you do now, so you will understand me. I was the youngest of 10 or maybe 12 children. It's hard to know the number. They were all sold away, and it was too painful to think of. The possibility of being taken from my parents and the brother I knew the longest, Peter, hung over me like an oncoming storm. And one day, that storm broke. I was sold for $100 to an English-speaking family, the Neelys, tearing me away from my family and my home. I was about 9 years old. It was hard. Not only the work, because I was their only slave, but the cold. I never had proper clothing. And the beatings, because I spoke no English and the Neelys spoke no Dutch. So I was forever misunderstanding what they wanted of me and beaten mercilessly as if I were disobeying. I prayed that my dear father would come and rescue me, and God heard my prayers. Within a year or so, I was sold away from the Neelys and on to the Schrijver family of Kingston, New York. That's a name I know you recognize in English, Schrijver or Scriver. The Schrijvers were an important family. The branch that I lived with owned an inn and sold fish. My work as a slave was varied. I carried fish, I farmed, I gathered herbs, I made beer, I shopped whatever needed to be done. When I was 12 or 13, I was sold once again, this time to John Dumont, who went to the same Dutch Reformed church as the Shrivers. Mr. Dumont paid about $175 for me. I lived with the Dumont family for about 16 years, during which time I married and had 5 children. I lived longer with the Dumonts than I had lived with my own parents and my brother, Peter. I did farm work for the Dumonts, and Mr. Dumont used to boast that I could do as much work as half a dozen white people and do it well, too. I didn't know it then, but that planted a little seed in my head that blossomed later when I made speeches about women's rights. You see, the scale of slavery in the North was not like slavery in the South, though it was just as evil. Half the Black slaves in New York State lived in communities of 20 or more Black people. Many plantations and farms in the South were very large compared to the farms in the North. And in New York State, where I was born, large numbers of Black people were only in New York City. In rural New York, however, where I grew up, a Dutch family might have only 1 or 2 slaves. In our county of Ulster, the population was about 30,000 people, and about 10% of them were Black people scattered widely across the countryside. In the South, however, the slave population was less than 1/10 of the total population in the year 1680, but grew to 1/3 by the year 1790, around the time I was born. That year, 42% of all slaves in the US were living in Virginia. By the year 1860, the total population of slaves in the US grew to almost 4 million poor souls. North or South, slavery was a life of constant trauma. So I knew a little something about the life of these Washington, D.C. refugees. But I had the advantage of knowing Quakers and other anti-slavery folks and had personal experience with their advocacy and support. Most of the refugees I worked with in Washington had no idea there were white people who would help a Black man or woman. So I told them the story of my son, Peter. My Peter, only 5 or 6 years old and named after my beloved brother, had been sold to by Mr. Dumont to his wife's cousin, who in turn sold him to his brother, who then sold poor Peter again, this time to a brother-in-law in Alabama. Alabama, 1,000 miles away. And it was illegal to do so against New York state law. I appealed to the Dumonts and to their cousins and to their in-laws, but to no avail. But the Holy Spirit was there for me. With money and introductions from Ulster County Quakers and some prominent Dutch lawyers, I entered a complaint with the Ulster County Grand Jury. That's right, a Black enslaved woman, they say the first Black woman to sue a white man in the United States. It took about a year, but my Peter was returned to Ulster County and returned to me. He was in a frightful state. He had been beaten savagely. He was depressed and frightened, but I got him back and I took him to New York. Slavery ended in New York State on the 4th of July in 1827, sort of. If you had been born before 1799, you were free. If you were born after 1799, then you became an indentured servant until you were 28 years old if you were male, and until you were 25 years old if you were female. That meant all my children were indentured servants, even though my husband Thomas and I were free. And if you ask me, indentured servant was no better than slavery. Oh, there were a few rights legally, but many servants did not know what they were, and many owners didn't follow them anyway. But I was done with slavery. I was done with serving anyone but God and my family. I heard the voice of God telling me to go out on my own as a free woman. So just before dawn, on a fall day, I took my youngest child, baby Sophia, and left my husband and other children at the Dumonts. And I walked about 5 miles away to the home of Levi Rowe. I told him what God had told me, and he urged me to go to the home of Isaac and Maria van Wagenen of Wagendale. I had known them for years, and I'm sure you know that name too, though it was often changed to Van Wagner. The Van Wagenens were another prominent family in these parts, and also members of the Klein Esopus Dutch Reformed Church. But they opposed slavery. When Mr. Dumont came after Sophia and me, the Van Wagenens paid him $25 for me and $5 for Sophia. I thanked God. And I took the name Isabella van Wagenen for the year that I lived with these most excellent people. For some time, I had been following the Methodist Church. I lived and dressed simply. I gave up drinking liquor, although I didn't give up smoking for another 40 years. But soon after I moved in with the Van Wagenens, I helped found the Kingston Methodist Church, which still stands today. Our beliefs in the Holy Spirit and our style of worshiping are what you would recognize as Pentecostal today. Not only did Black worship with whites in this church, but women were allowed to speak freely of their love for God and to give witness to his goodness. This was the beginning of my many years of preaching. In June 1843, I was born again, choosing to name myself Sojourner Truth. After 30 years of slavery and 15 years of making myself free through the power of the Holy Spirit, I now travel throughout the United States, denouncing enslavement and enslavers, and advocating temperance, freedom, women's rights, and women's suffrage, a woman's right to vote. I gave speeches, I preached, and I discussed and debated with others. I could neither read nor write, but my biographers will tell you that I was highly intelligent, and the common understanding of illiterate did not apply to me. On top of this 5'11" body was a brain filled with ideas, conviction, persuasive arguments, and wit. While I may not have been able to write my own accounts, my own letters, my own essays, others captured them relatively accurately. I say relatively. You will see articles and biographies that have me speaking with a Southern accent. I was no Southerner. As I said, I was born and raised in New York State, outside of Kingston, County of Ulster, the Hudson Valley. So you can imagine what a life story like mine could mean to a refugee who had escaped from slavery, or who had been freed and ended up in Washington, D.C., in a camp run by white folks saying they were there to help. Someone like me who had been enslaved too, and now was independent and self-supporting. In fact, the Freedmen's Intelligence and Employment Agency put over 5,000 of these folks in jobs within the first couple of years I was working with the refugees. I placed about 100 people in jobs myself. There were far more that needed jobs, and the conditions of the camps were rough. In some camps, worse than rough. But it was better than slavery, that's for sure. I hear now about the refugees and immigrants that come to the United States from other places, and how you have established programs to help them get settled, help orient them in a new land, a new culture, a new way of life. Advocacy, education, integrity, inclusion, and intersectionality. That's the AAUW way. I hear about the AAUW's efforts to get equal pay for working women. That is a familiar tune and good history being repeated. When I was helping to get the vote for women, the vote was just one thread in what I saw as a tapestry of equity and fairness. And although they were eventually to separate and become different tapestries, there were many common threads between the rights we sought for women and the ones we sought for Black people. Women's rights to their wages, their inheritance, and the custody of their children, for example, which were not guaranteed. What Black man or Black woman did not want rights to their wages, their inheritance, and the custody of their children? Women and Black people wanted admission to colleges and universities that had been reserved for white men. We wanted to serve on juries, to hold office, to vote. 3 court cases had been fought on my behalf because I didn't have the right to fight them myself. And I said, in the courts, women have no right, no voice. Nobody speaks for them. My point was that things are connected: the vote, property ownership, education, wages, and family. Intersectionality. I was a poor working Black woman. I knew about that life. Again and again, I talked about equal pay, and not just for the white woman or Black man. I said, I have done a great deal of work, as much as any man, but did not get so much pay. I used to work in the field and bind grain, keeping up with the cradler, but men, doing no more, got twice as much pay. So with the German women. They work in the field and do as much work, but do not get the pay. We do as much, we eat as much, we want as much. As Nell Irvin Painter, one of my biographers, put it, I was equating women's voting with a recasting of the entire political economy. It was all connected in my view. So you keep fighting for equal pay. That's good history being repeated. There are still many things we worked hard for that you are working hard for now. We are all deserving of equity, and I encourage you to continue. I can only use the examples of what my colleagues and I did. Speak, preach, debate, persuade, use facts, use life stories, use arguments that touch both the heart and the mind. Much opposition comes from fear. Do your research, figure out what your opponents are afraid of, and speak to that. My friends, it is we who repeat history. Our job is to repeat good history, not the bad history. And it is our job to make good history. The history of the AAUW has made many good things happen, and I urge you to continue. I thank you for listening. Good day and good evening to you.
You were wonderful.
Thank you. I hope you all enjoyed it.
Oh, I did indeed.
You know, if the AAUW had been around back then, she would have joined.
Ms. Truth has volunteered to answer questions if anybody has any. I have one. That saying, ain't I a woman? It's said often. Did she really say that?
In May 1851, I spoke at the Ohio Women's Rights Convention in Akron. It was held in a church and it was packed. I sat on the steps to the pulpit. It was so crowded. Some people noted that the presence of a Black woman at the Worcester Convention had not made race an issue. One man said men shouldn't speak at a women's convention, but many women felt that as a women's rights convention, all those supporting women's rights should speak freely. And you must understand that back then, women and children were expected to be seen and not heard. It was not considered proper for a woman to speak publicly, to congregate publicly without her husband. And certainly it was not considered proper pardon me, for a woman to have an opinion about anything other than domestic life. So a convention of hundreds of women was considered rebellious and impoliteness of the highest order. Believe it or not, men and women alike thought there would be riots, perhaps women dressed as men, or even tearing their clothes off. Some accounts of the conventions expressed surprise at how well-behaved, well-spoken, and well-dressed we were. Some of my sister speakers were not in agreement about slavery and race having a place in the suffrage movement, even whether Black people belonged in women's rights meetings at all. But others, Black and white, male and female, argued that the existence of race within questions of sex should be acknowledged. Some of my Black sisters fell silent about women's rights when Black men's rights were in question. They rallied to the side of Black men and let the question of sex go. As Mr. Marius Robinson wrote in an editorial in the only anti-slavery paper west of the Alleghenies, the Anti-Slavery Bugle, he said in an editorial, "The business of the convention was principally conducted by the women. The manner in which they acquitted themselves must, we think, have convinced the most skeptical." The Boston Liberator said, "No person could have attended this convention and then said that woman was unqualified to sustain an equal position with man." Mr. Marius Robinson, this editor, he supported women's rights and was used to my way of speaking, and he wrote down my speech that day. In later years, accounts of my speech were embellished and dramatized, but Mr. Robinson's account was published right after I made the speech, and I think the most accurate. First of all, I did not presume. I asked the convention organizers, "May I say a few words?" And only when I was invited did I speak. I want to say a few words about this matter. I am for a woman's rights. I have as much muscle as any man and can do as much work as any man. I have plowed and reaped and husked and chopped and mowed. And can any man do more than that? I've heard much about the sexes being equal. I can carry as much as any man, and I can eat as much too if I can get it. I am as strong as any man that is now. As for intellect, all I can say is, if a woman have a pint and a man have a quart, why can't she have her little pintful? You need not be afraid to give us our rights for fear we will take too much, for we can't take more than our pint will hold. I can't read, but I can hear. I have heard the Bible and I have learned that Eve caused man to sin. Well, if woman upset the world, do give her a chance to set it right side up again. How came Jesus into the world? Through God, who created him, and a woman who bore him. Man, where was your part? What do you think of that? I knew a little bit about women's rights and wanted to throw in my little piece to keep the scales moving. There are different versions of my speech, and you probably have heard that I use the phrase, "Ain't I a woman?" several times to make my point. But the person who wrote that also wrote that I spoke in a Southern dialect. I told you, I was a New Yorker. Still, I got my point across, and I sold a lot of my books too, so I could pay off the printer.
I'm fascinated by your quilt behind you. Does it have a story?
It does not have a story, unless I make one up. So it's a modern quilt. But as we know, quilts were used during the slave times for the Underground Railroad. There were symbols and things in them to give directions and messages. So this is not one of those, but I like to have it behind me in sort of in honor of those quilts.
And
I wonder if you, yes, go ahead.
When did you decide to be a Sojourner Truth? Take that part.
I was walking through the area where she was born and grew up, and came upon her the plaque. And certainly I had learned about her in school, but suddenly I was hit. She grew up right here? so many people that we read about in our history books or learn about, they're far away. Certainly as a child, I didn't feel like I had much in common with the different people I was learning about. But here I was, essentially in her backyard, and it caused me to go and look up her story again. And I just became enamored. And I thought, people have to know the more up-to-date history. All these celebrity actors who do the "Ain't I a Woman" speech in a Southern dialect. And I thought, it's my job to educate and to bring people up to date with her. So that's how it happened.
Thank you.
And the ironic thing is that I began to realize that there are pieces of Sojourner in my life since childhood. I had written a paper on her in elementary school. I went to Tufts University undergrad, and one of the academic awards for high academic achievement was the Sojourner Truth Award. I won that one year. So she's been with me since childhood. I didn't realize it. And so that's why I call her sort of my soul sister.
Judy?
Question.
Hi, I'm Faye Marcus from the Rockford branch, and we have a very wonderful sculpture here dedicated to the women who have been involved with with civil rights and with the women's right to vote. And Sojourner's Truth picture is on that sculpture. So
wonderful. Yes, she was very active, and because she did go across the country, she was known everywhere.
Certainly brought her to life.
Oh, I'm so glad. So Amy asks, aside from the accent, what's the biggest thing that people get wrong about Sojourner Truth? I don't know what the biggest thing is, but I will tell you another thing that irks me as a history buff. Because again, we hear stories. We hear that Sojourner Truth met with President Lincoln. I mean, imagine this, a formerly enslaved woman meeting not only a president, but the president who got the Emancipation Proclamation passed. Well, let me tell the story in Sojourner's perspective. Early in the 1860s, friends raised enough money to pay for me to travel to Washington, D.C. to see President Lincoln. There are many accounts of my encounter with the president, most of them embellished and far from the truth. But I will say this, Mr. Lincoln was true to himself, and I was true to myself. I had a little autograph book that he signed. He wrote, "For Auntie Sojourner Truth." Not Miss Truth, but Auntie. Same as he called his washerwoman. Equality for women, equality for the Black man and Black woman. I'll leave you to draw your own conclusions.
Are there questions from anybody else or comments? This has been very enlightening. Thank you.
So glad, and thank you so much for the invitation and for the opportunity to share a passion with you all. Thank you. I wish you all good night.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.